The Arizona territory tasted of alkali dust and endings. In the late autumn of 1886, the wind had stripped the last of the color from the high plains, leaving only shades of rust and bone. It was a wind that did not whisper. It scoured. Nora Lark felt it scouring her. She sat alone on the wagon bench, the reins loose in her chapped hands. The mule pulling the small buckboard was as tired as she was, its head hanging low, plodding through the deepening ruts of the pass known as Devil's Notch. She was a scrivener, a woman whose trade was in the clean, precise lines of ink on paper, in the balanced columns of ledgers and the careful stamping of deeds. It was a trade that had failed her in Prescott. A bigger firm had taken her work, claimed it as their own, and paid her a fraction of the wages owed. Just enough to be seen as legal, not enough to be fair. Cinder Hollow was just a name on a map, a place to go because she could not stay. But the notch was living up to its name. The canyon walls pressed in, close and silent, the red rock bleeding into the purple shadows of the dying day. They did not ride out with a war cry. They simply emerged from the rock itself. 3 men, their faces masked by trail dust and discolored neckerchiefs. The man in the lead was broad, his duster stiff with grime. He raised a hand, and the gesture was so casual it was terrifying. Nora pulled the mule to a halt. The animal shuddered, grateful for the rest, unaware of the danger. The lead man ambled closer. He stopped 10 feet away, his eyes, the only living thing visible in the mask of dirt, crinkling at the corners. He was enjoying this. "Well now, get down, ma'am. We got some business." His voice was like gravel churning in a dry creek bed. Nora's hands tightened on the reins, but she did not move. "I have no money. What little I had was spent on supplies." The man chuckled. "We ain't collectors, ma'am. We're more auditors." He motioned with his pistol. "Down." Nora climbed down slowly. Her legs felt brittle, as if they might snap. The other 2 men, shadows with rifles, moved to the back of her wagon and began pulling out her meager possessions, a small trunk, a canvas sack of food, a roll of bedding. "Look for it, Vern," one of them called. The leader, Vern Slater, walked around her, circling like a coyote. "You're Nora Lark, the letter writer." It was not a question. "Heard you keep a fine hand. Real neat. People trust a neat hand." He stopped in front of her. He smelled of sweat, stale whiskey, and something metallic, like old blood. "Barlow, he don't like people keeping books he ain't authorized, especially books about his business. Makes him particular." One of his men ripped open her trunk. Her few dresses were tossed into the dust. Then he found the wooden box. It held her quills, her ink pots, her ledgers, and her seals. He threw it to the ground. The lid burst open, spilling the tools of her life onto the hard-packed earth. "There's ledgers! Vern!" Slater's eyes lit with a cruel satisfaction. He kicked at a small, leather-bound book, sending it skidding toward the cliff edge. "That's trash," he said, pulling her bag from the wagon. He emptied its contents, a comb, a small mirror, a few coins that rolled and vanished in the twilight, and her personal papers. He snatched them up, glanced at them, then crumpled them in his fist and threw them over his shoulder. "You've been asking questions. Missy, writing things down for folks who can't pay their way. Writing down debts Barlow considers. Private. He sent me to give you a warning, to make sure you understand that your pen ain't welcome in Cinder Hollow." Nora watched her life scatter in the wind. The tremor began in her knees and worked its way up, but she locked her jaw against it. "I am just a scrivener. I record what I am paid to record. And you wasn't paid to copy his." Slater growled. He jerked his head toward the cliff's edge, where the rock fell away into 1,000 feet of shadow. One of his men tossed a shovel at her feet. It landed with a dull thud. "What's that?" Nora whispered, though she already knew. "That," Slater said, "is your final bill. Barlow wanted to send a message. Said to tell the little ink slinger to dig her own grave." The air left Nora's lungs. The 2 men behind her raised their rifles. Their postures relaxed, as if they were waiting for a stagecoach. This was routine. "Get to it," Slater ordered. "Sun's almost down. We ain't got all night to watch you sweat." Nora looked at the shovel. She looked at the three men. Her mind, trained to observe details, began to work despite the cold terror gripping her spine. The wind was blowing east, from her back toward the men. Slater's pistol was in a low-slung holster, the leather tie-down unfastened. The man to her left had a newer model rifle, the one on the right an older repeater. She was measuring them, calculating, just as she would the margins on a page. It was a useless, desperate act, but it was all she had. She bent and picked up the shovel. Her hands, soft from paper and ink, felt the splintered wood. She was shaking so hard the shovel head rattled against the rock. "Right there." Slater pointed to a patch of softer earth near the edge. "Make it deep." Nora bit her lip until she tasted copper. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She jammed the shovel into the earth. The first spadeful was hard. The ground was rocky, resistant. It was like digging into her own despair. With each movement, she measured the wind again. She watched Slater's boot, just visible at the edge of her vision. She listened. The only sounds were her own ragged breathing and the scrape, scrape of steel on rock. She dug for what felt like an hour. The hole was perhaps a foot deep, a pathetic, shallow scar in the earth. Her shoulders burned. Her hands were raw. The sun had dipped below the canyon rim, and the air turned instantly, bitingly cold. "That's pitiful," Slater sneered. "Put your back into it, or we'll put a bullet in your back." Nora summoned all the strength she had left and drove the shovel down. It struck solid gravel with a loud, metallic clink. The sound was a period at the end of a sentence. It was final. "Well," Slater said, pulling his pistol from its holster. "Looks like you hit bedrock. Guess that's as far as you go." The world narrowed to the round, black mouth of the pistol he was leveling at her head. Nora closed her eyes. A dry, metallic click echoed through the pass. It was the sound of a rifle's hammer being pulled to full cock, but it had not come from Slater's men. "That's far enough." The voice was deep, laced with gravel and authority. It came from the ridge above them, from the rocks to the south. Slater froze. His men spun around, raising their rifles toward the sound. "Who's there?" Slater yelled. "Show yourself." "I'm shown." A man and a horse materialized from the shadows, as if carved from the same red rock. The horse was a powerful dapple gray, its eyes wide and intelligent, its breath pluming in the cold. The man on its back was tall, broad-shouldered, and seemed to be part of the saddle. He wore a brimmed hat pulled low, but the twilight glinted off the long, dark barrel of the Spencer rifle he held cradled in his arm. It was pointed not at Slater, but at the space between all three men. He urged the horse, "Storm," a few steps forward, placing himself deliberately, impossibly, between Nora and the three guns. "This ain't your business, stranger," Slater said, trying to regain his footing. He kept his pistol trained on Nora, but his attention was split. "A woman digging her own hole?" the stranger said, his voice quiet but carrying on the wind. "That's an ugly piece of work." The wind gusted, bringing the sharp, clean scent of sagebrush. Red dust kicked up from under Storm's hooves. The horse stood like a statue, unafraid. The tension in the pass was so thick it was a physical weight. "This is Barlow's business," Slater warned. "You ride on. You'll live to see morning." The stranger's gaze flickered to Nora, still clutching the shovel, her knuckles white. He looked at the rope burns on her wrists, where they had tied her briefly to search the wagon. His eyes, dark and unreadable under the brim, moved back to Slater. "I don't hold with Barlow," he said. Slater made his decision. "Kill him!" he shouted to his men. But the stranger was faster. He did not aim for Slater, or his men. The Spencer rifle cracked, the sound sharp and definitive. It was not a warning shot into the air. 20 feet from Slater, the canteen hanging from his saddle horn exploded, a silver flash of water and tin fragments. The horse next to Slater whinnied and reared, terrified. Slater's men, their aim broken by the sudden shot and the rearing horse, fired wild. The bullets whined off the rocks, high and wide. The stranger did not move, the smoking rifle steady in his grip. His horse, Storm, merely flicked an ear. "The next one." The stranger's voice cut through the ringing in their ears. "Won't be water." He looked directly at Slater. "Try coming back." Slater, his face a mask of fury and sudden fear, stared at the man. He saw the Spencer, the steady hand, the horse that didn't bolt. He was outpositioned and outclassed. He spat into the dust. "This ain't over, rancher," he snarled. He motioned to his men. "Let's go. She ain't worth dying for." He holstered his pistol, gathered his horse, and without another look at Nora, galloped down the pass, his men close behind. Their hoofbeats faded, leaving an aching, sudden silence. Nora stood for a long moment, the shovel still in her hands. The wind keened, blowing dust into the shallow hole she had dug. Then the strength that had held her upright, the defiant terror, finally gave way. The shovel slipped from her numb fingers. The world tilted, the red rocks spinning into a black void. She collapsed, a heap of exhaustion on the cold ground. Gideon Rourke watched her fall. He dismounted in one fluid motion. The Spencer never leaving his hand, he checked the pass, his eyes scanning the ridges where the gunmen had fled. Satisfied they were gone, he slung the rifle over his back and walked to her. He knelt. She was small, covered in dust, her face pale as parchment in the gloom. He gently turned her wrist over, examining the raw, red welts from the rope. A muscle in his jaw tightened. He had seen too much of this, too much of Barlow's brand of justice. With a sigh that seemed to pull from the very earth, he scooped her up. She was lighter than he expected, a bundle of grit and bone. He carried her to Storm, lifting her easily onto the saddle. He mounted behind her, his left arm a solid bar around her waist, holding her securely against his chest. He looked down at the shallow grave, at the scattered tools of her trade. He would come back for them. For now, he needed to get her away. He turned Storm toward the basin, away from Cinder Hollow, from a high ridge, half a mile away. A fourth man watched the scene through a brass spyglass. Deputy Walt Rusk, his tin star hidden under his duster, lowered the glass. He pulled a small notebook and a pencil from his vest pocket. He licked the pencil lead, and by the last light of the fading sun, he made a careful, precise entry. Slater engaged the scrivener. Rourke interfered. One woman taken to Larkspur Basin. He closed the notebook, put it away, and turned his own horse. He did not ride toward the pass. He did not ride toward the ranch. He rode toward the faint, distant lights of Cinder Hollow, his silhouette shrinking against the vast, indifferent twilight. The first thing she smelled was not dust, but damp hay, old leather, and the faint, bitter tang of wood smoke. Consciousness returned to Nora Lark not as a gentle dawn, but as a dull, pounding ache that started behind her eyes and radiated down to her wrists. She was lying on something coarse, a settee, upholstered in faded wool. She opened her eyes. The room was cast in the deep orange glow of a low fire. It was a single, large room, the corners lost in shadow. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a cold iron stove used for cooking, and a man, his back to her, standing by the stove, stirring something in a black iron pot. It was the man from the pass. The memory surged back, hot and terrifying. Slater's voice, the scrape of the shovel, the black mouth of the pistol. "Dig your own grave?" Nora sat bolt upright. The room spun violently. A wave of nausea and dizziness crashed over her, forcing her to grip the edge of the settee. The man turned. He was not wearing his hat. His hair was dark, thick, and unkempt. His face, seen fully, was hard-planed, stubbled with a few days' growth, and etched with lines that spoke of sun, wind, and something deeper. He was not old, but he was not young. He looked at her with eyes that held no warmth, only a flat, assessing calm. "You're awake," he said. His voice was the same. that deep resonance from the cliff. "Where am I?" Her voice was a dry rasp. "My place, Larkspur Basin." He gestured with the spoon. "It's safe enough, for now. I have to leave." She tried to stand, to push herself to her feet. Her body betrayed her. Her legs felt like water, and the throbbing in her wrists, now a deep, ugly purple, screamed in protest. She fell back against the cushions, defeated and furious. "You're in no state to ride," he observed, not unkindly, just stating a fact. "And your wagon's still at the notch. I'll fetch it and your mule come morning. If they're still there, they'll be gone. They'll have taken everything. They weren't there for your mule." He turned back to the pot. He ladled a thick, steaming liquid into 2 tin bowls. "It's bean soup. It's all there is." He brought one bowl over and set it on a small crate near the settee. He handed her a spoon. He did not help her. He just provided the means. Nora's stomach roiled, but she knew the dizziness was from hunger and shock as much as anything. She took the spoon. Her hand was shaking. He sat at the main table, his back to the wall, and began to eat. The silence in the cabin was profound. It was broken only by the scrape of their spoons and the loud, metronomic tick, tock, tick, tock of a pendulum clock on the mantel. The sound was oppressive. Each tick a second of her life she could not account for. Each tock a reminder of the things suspended in the air between them. The ranch was not just quiet. It was empty. She could feel the absence of people. Looking around, she saw the signs of neglect. The fences she had seen on the ride in were broken, their rails scattered like kindling. The barn, which she had glimpsed, was large, but its doors hung on one hinge. This cabin, though sturdy, had a film of dust on the surfaces that were not in daily use. A woman's touch was long gone, if it had ever been there at all. This man, Gideon Rourke, lived alone. He had been alone for a long time. The soup was coarse, nourishing, and unseasoned. Nora ate, forcing each spoonful down. With every swallow, a small measure of strength returned. "Why?" she finally asked. He looked up, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Why did you stop? You put yourself between their guns and me. You don't know me." Gideon Rourke finished the spoonful, took his time. "I know Vern Slater, and I know who he works for. What they were doing was wrong, that's all." "That's not all," Nora insisted, the scrivener in her demanding a balanced ledger. "You risked your life. They work for Barlow. You just made an enemy of the most powerful man in this territory. All for a stranger. Barlow was my enemy long before you showed up." His voice was flat, containing a history she could not read. He pushed his empty bowl away. "They'll come here. They'll come for me. And they'll punish you. Let them try." The sheer finality of it chilled her. "I can't stay. I won't put you in any more danger." "Where will you go?" he asked. "Back to Cinder Hollow. Slater will be waiting. Back to Prescott. You were running from there." She flinched. "How did you know?" "Your hands," he said, nodding at them. "They're soft, ink-stained on the right forefinger. You're not a homesteader. And your papers were scattered all over the pass. Deeds, ledgers. You're a letter writer, a good one. I'd wager to make Slater that angry." Nora set her bowl down. The time for half-truths was over. "I'm more than that. I don't just write letters. I copy ledgers. I draw maps of mining claims and water rights. I see how the numbers are weighted." She looked directly at him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Barlow is cheating the people of this valley. He's charging them transport fees he has no right to, seizing their land when they can't pay. I was hired by a small group of them, in secret, to make a copy of his private books. A record, proof." Gideon's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "And Slater was sent to get that copy." "Yes, but he didn't." Nora's voice dropped. "He threw my trunk open. He thought the ledgers there were the only ones. He didn't find the real prize. I keep the master copy on me." "He searched you. He didn't search well enough." Gideon waited. The clock ticked. "Barlow isn't just a tyrant," Gideon said, his voice lowering, the sound seeming to come from the shadows in the corner. He's a plague. He rose and walked to the fireplace. He picked up a small, tin-framed photograph from the mantel, obscuring the clock. He stared at it for a long moment. I had a wife, Eliza. She was the life in this place. The fever came through 2 years ago. Not the pox, something in the water. It burned through the valley. The doctor in Prescott had a serum, a new one from back east. But to get it, you had to be on the train. He set the photograph back down, his hand lingering on the tin. Barlow owns the spur line. He'd just bought it. He declared a freight fee for all non-ore cargo, including medicine. Said it was for hazard insurance. It was 10 times the usual rate. $100. Cash. I didn't have it. No one in the basin did. Not after the drought. I rode to his office. I begged. He had me thrown out. He turned to face Nora. The firelight carved canyons on his face. Eliza died 3 days later. She died while a crate of that serum sat on a platform in Cinder Hollow because I couldn't pay Barlow's fee. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. The clock ticked. So, no, Gideon said, his voice raw. Barlow was already my enemy. Saving you. That was just practice. The desert night pressed against the thin cabin walls. The cold of the high plains was a living thing, seeping through the cracks in the doorframe, under the window sills. Nora shivered. And it wasn't just from the story. Gideon saw it. He walked to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed, a simple rope-strung cot. He pulled out 2 thick wool blankets. You take the bed, he said, tossing them onto the mattress. No, I can't. That's your bed. I'll take the settee. It's the only bed, and I'm not having this argument. You're injured and you need rest. I'll take the floor by the fire. He didn't wait for her to protest again. He took one of the thinner blankets for himself and spread it on the floorboards, rolling up a saddlebag for a pillow. He was establishing a boundary, a line of respect that was as clear and solid as a stone wall. He was a man who had lost his wife, not a man looking to replace her. The knowledge settled something in Nora. She moved to the cot, her body aching, and lay down on top of the covers, pulling the wool blankets over her. She lay awake, listening to the 2 sounds of the cabin, the steady ticking of the clock, and the quiet, even breathing of the man on the floor. Outside, a coyote howled, a lonely, desperate sound that was answered by another, and then another, until the darkness was full of their calls. But in here, the small fire held the shadows at bay. It was a fragile, temporary safety, but it was more than she'd had in months. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light. She could see Gideon's table, cluttered not with plates, but with papers, large, rolled sheets. They were drawings. Curiosity, the defining trait of her mind, pulled at her. She sat up, quietly. Gideon was asleep, or at least pretending to be. She slipped off the cot, her bare feet cold on the wood floor, and crept to the table. She unrolled one of the drawings. It was a map, a technical drawing, a plan for an irrigation canal, sketched in charcoal, with notations for angles and gradients. It was ambitious, designed to pull water from the small creek in the basin and spread it across the dry fields. It was also flawed. She studied it, her scrivener's mind assessing the lines. He had the main angle of descent too steep. He was accounting for volume, but not for erosion. The channel would leak within a season, and the banks would collapse in 2. Without thinking, she picked up the charcoal stub. She looked at Gideon. His breathing was deep and even. She made 2 quick, precise marks on the paper, adding a new, shallower line. She drew a small diagram in the margin, a cross-section showing a gentler slope, with a note, angle too severe, risk of breach at junction. She set the charcoal down. Her fingers smudged black. As she turned, she saw his eyes. He was wide awake, watching her from the floor. He had been watching her the whole time. She froze. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. It's just the angle. He stared at the spot where she stood, then pushed himself up on one elbow. He looked at the drawing on the table. He looked at her correction. He traced the new line she had drawn with his finger. He was silent for a long time. The coyote calls had faded. "You're right," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "I've been digging it for 6 months. It keeps washing out. I couldn't see why." He looked back at her, and for the first time, the flat, hard calm in his eyes was replaced by something else. A flicker of, not softness, but acknowledgement. He had seen her not as a burden, but as a mind. "Get some sleep, Scrivener," he said, lying back down and turning his face toward the fire. "Tomorrow I'll fetch your things." Nora returned to the cot. As she lay down, she saw his saddle, draped over a wooden horse in the corner. One of the straps, the one holding the main cinch, was frayed. She had seen it when he dismounted, the leather fibers hanging by a thread, while the fire burned low and the rancher slept. Nora Lark pulled a small sewing kit from her pocket, a kit Slater's men had missed, with quiet, practiced motions. She took the thick needle, the waxed thread, and began to mend the broken leather, stitch by stitch, pulling the disparate, failing edges together, making them one, making them strong. The fire burned down to embers, leaving the room in near total darkness. The clock ticked on. Miles away, at the edge of the basin, a lone figure stood by the broken fence line. The moon was a pale sliver, but it was enough. The man knelt, examining the ground. He saw the tracks of the single horse, Storm, carrying double. He pressed his own boot into the damp earth beside the track, leaving a deep, clear impression of a military-style heel. And then, satisfied, he melted back into the shadows. Gideon returned at dawn, the sound of the mule braying, a hollow and tired sound, announcing his arrival before his shadow crossed the doorway. He had the buckboard. He'd walked the last mile, leading the mule and his own horse, Storm, to spare them. He said nothing as he entered, but his eyes went to the saddle in the corner. He saw the new, tight stitches on the cinch strap, the waxed thread a shade darker than the worn leather. He ran a thumb over the repair, a solid, expert mend. He looked at Nora, who was packing the last of the tin bowls. It was a silent, complex acknowledgement, a debt paid without a word. "They took the food," he said, handing her the small wooden box of her quills and inks. "But they left the rest. Your trunk is in the wagon. They must have thought they'd scared you off for good." "They don't know what they're looking for," Nora replied, her voice tight. She took the box, her knuckles white. They brought the small trunk inside. It was not locked. Slater's men had been clumsy, breaking the hasp. Nora knelt before it, her hands moving with purpose. She lifted the false bottom, a trick of her trade, revealing a space no thicker than a book. From it, she removed not one, but 3 slim, oilskin-wrapped packets. She spread the contents on Gideon's table, pushing aside his technical drawings of the canal. The cabin, which had felt like a refuge, instantly became a war room. The papers were not just ledgers, they were an arsenal. There was the copied ledger, its columns neat and damning, showing every $5 fee Barlow had extracted. There were her own hand-drawn maps, showing how the water from the upper creeks, all marked as public land, was being systematically diverted to Barlow's new mining operations miles away. And there was the final, most terrible document, a simple, single-page list. "This is the one that matters," she said, her finger tracing the names. "It's a list of transport fees for medical conveyance, the same fee he charged you." She looked up, her eyes holding his. "There are 12 names on this list from the last 2 years. Gideon, 12 people who died. He was charging them for a service that was supposed to be free by county decree. I found the order, 1884. It's null and void." Gideon stared at the list, his face like carved stone. He read the names, and she saw him mouth one, Eliza. His name was not on the list, because he had never paid, but the others, they had paid, and the medicine had never come, or it had come too late. Barlow was not just a monopolist, he was a murderer, using paper as his weapon. "We need to protect these," Nora said, her voice dropping to a whisper. This oilskin is old. It's cracking. If they get wet, the ink will run, and it will just be our word against his. She looked at him, her gaze practical, but desperate. I need better oilskin, and I need more ink, a specific kind, India ink. It doesn't fade. Gideon nodded. Alma Heath, at the forge in town. She's not a friend of Barlow. She'll have what you need. You shouldn't go, Nora said, her resolution wavering. They'll be watching for you. They'll be watching for us, he corrected her. Me, they're used to. I'm just the crazy widower in the basin. I go to town once a month. This is that time. He picked up his hat. Barricade the door. Don't open it for anyone. Not even if you hear my voice. Unless I give the signal. What signal? I'll ask you about the angle of the main junction, he said. A small, grim understanding passed between them. He was trusting her mind, not just her fear. He left, and the sound of the door's heavy wooden bar falling into place was a sharp, lonely sound. He was gone for 6 hours. 6 hours that Nora spent pacing the small cabin, the clock on the mantel ticking like a bomb. She sharpened every quill. She tidied Gideon's messy plans, redrawing his canal map on a fresh piece of paper, incorporating her corrections, just to keep her hands from shaking. When he returned, he did not use the signal. He simply appeared in the doorway, his face grim, and she knew he had news. He dropped a parcel on the table, the heavy, waxy-smelling oilskin and 2 bottles of thick, black ink. They're not just diverting the water, he said, pulling off his gloves. Alma heard it from the surveyors themselves. Barlow's putting in a rail spur, right through the middle of Larkspur Basin. It's not for passengers. It's for ore, and it's going to cut the creek off. Permanently. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. But this is homestead land. He can't. He can if no one's living on it, Gideon said darkly. He's going to dry us out, then buy the land for pennies on the dollar at auction. Alma says anyone who won't sell. Accidents, like the fire that took Old Man Hemphill's barn last month, or the stray cattle that stampeded the Pearsons' crop. Nora's hands began to fly. She grabbed the new ink, the quills, and the ledgers. He's not just using paper, she said, her voice a low, furious hum. He's using invoices. He's hiding his tracks. For the next hour, she worked. She unrolled a set of ore weight tickets. Gideon had kept proof of what he'd sold to the SA office. Then she pulled out the invoices Barlow had issued. She began to cross-reference them. There, she said, her hands shaking, but not from fear, from rage. Look, this is your weight ticket. 10 tons of raw copper ore, signed by the assay. And this is Barlow's invoice for transport and smelting. He's charged you for 15 tons. He's inflating the weight by 50% on the back end. He's stealing, Gideon said. He's protected, Nora countered, jabbing her finger at the bottom of the invoice. Look at the signature, the approval stamp. A. Kit Sheriff. Every single false invoice, every hazard fee, every overcharge. It's all co-signed by Sheriff Ambrose Kit. He's not just on the payroll. He's the bookkeeper for the whole rotten enterprise. The air in the room was suffocating. The knowledge was a physical weight. We have to hide this, Nora said, standing. The copy is good, but the original, the one I took, it has to disappear. Somewhere they'll never find it. Gideon thought for a moment. The old mission, St. Jude's, it's been abandoned since the '68 earthquake. No one goes there but the wind. They rode out together, not on the road, but through the high chaparral. Gideon in the lead, Nora riding the mule. The abandoned church stood on a lonely rise, its bell tower a jagged skeleton against the bruised purple sky. Inside, it smelled of dust, dry wood, and old, cold stone. Pigeons scattered from the rafters. Nora went to the chancel, to a single, large flagstone set before the ruined altar. Carved into it was a Latin phrase, Fiat Lux. Let there be light, she whispered, using a crowbar from Gideon's saddlebag. They prized the heavy stone up. Beneath it was dry, packed earth. Nora took the original ledger and the list of names. now wrapped tightly in the new, thick oilskin and sealed in a leather tube. She placed it in the hollow. "They'll find it," Gideon said. "Not if they're not looking for it." Nora replied. She took her own personal ledger, the one Slater had kicked and ignored, and placed it on top, just under the dirt. "A decoy. They'll find this and think they have the prize." They lowered the stone. It settled into place with a sound like a coffin closing. On the ride back, Gideon pulled Storm to a halt. He unstrapped a holster from his saddlebag. The pistol in it was smaller than his, a revolver with a bone-white handle. A Webley. "You need to know how," he said. It wasn't a request. He handed it to her. But first, the weight of it shocked her. A dense, cold purpose in her palm. This was Eliza's. She didn't like guns, but she knew how to use one. He showed her how to check the chambers, how to hold it, how to brace her arm. Her hand trembled, the barrel wavering. "Don't fight the shake," he said, his voice quiet, his hand resting on her shoulder for just a second. A steadying weight. "Don't aim at the man. Aim at a button on his shirt. Squeeze. Don't pull." He set a tin can on a rock 50 feet away. Nora raised the pistol. She sighted down the barrel. Her hand was shaking. Her breath was ragged. But as she looked at the can, the world went quiet. She saw only the glint of tin. She remembered Slater's face. She remembered the list of 12 names. Her hand went perfectly, unnaturally still. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the kick jarring her arm back, but the can, 50 feet away, vanished. Gideon stared at the place where the can had been. He looked at Nora, who was staring at the smoking pistol in her hand, her face pale. "Your eye is steady," he said, his voice hush. "Remember that." They rode back to the ranch in silence, but the sanctuary was gone. When they reached the barn, Gideon stopped. He pointed. The heavy wooden hasp that secured the main door was not broken. It was unpinned. The long iron pin lay in the dust. Someone had been here. They had not broken in. They had simply entered. Gideon drew his Spencer, waving Nora behind him. He entered the barn first, a shadow moving through the shafts of dusty light. It was empty. The horses were nickering nervously in their stalls, but they were unharmed. He pointed to the feed bin. The lid was open. The grain inside had been stirred, raked through by human hands. They had been searching. He moved to the cabin. The door was still barricaded. From the inside, he checked the window. It was latched. They didn't come in. Nora breathed. "No," Gideon said. He walked to the water pump by the door, then knelt. There, in the damp earth, was the same clear military-style boot print they had seen at the fence line. "He's watching. He wanted us to know he was here." That night, Gideon did not take the floor. He sat in the chair by the door, the Spencer across his lap. Nora tried to work, but her hands were cold. When Gideon rose to stoke the fire, she saw it. Sitting in the exact center of the rough-hewn kitchen table, gleaming in the lamplight, was a single, lead-nosed bullet. It had not been there when they left for the church. The message was clear. "We can get in. We can get to you any time we want." Nora looked at the bullet. She looked at the barricaded door, at the man guarding it, and the fear, the cold, corrosive fear that had gripped her since Devil's Notch, was suddenly burned away by a white-hot, precise rage. She picked up the bullet. "They think this will scare us." "It should," Gideon said. "It doesn't," she replied, her voice low and clear. "It just makes me angry. He wants to buy the land. He wants an auction." She looked at Gideon, her eyes as steady as they had been when she fired the Webley. "Then he'll have one. The land auction is next week. In the town square, in front of everyone. That's when I'll do it. I'll read the ledger. I'll read all 12 names." Gideon looked at her, at the small, determined set of her jaw. He looked at the bullet in her hand. He knew what kind of courage it took to make that stand. He also knew what kind of men they were facing. He turned to look out the dark window, at the vast, dangerous basin that held them. "They won't wait a week," he said. "They'll come sooner than we think." He was right. They did not wait a week. They did not even wait a day. The warning came not as a sound, but as a smell. Smoke, acrid, oily, and thick. Gideon was in the chair by the door, the Spencer across his knees, existing in that gray space between sleep and vigilance. The scent hit him a second before the horses began to scream. He was moving instantly, the chair scraping back as he threw the bar off the door. The barn. The night was no longer dark. The sky above the hay barn was a churning, roiling sheet of orange. Flames, 50 feet high, licked at the stars. The heat was a physical blow, even from 100 yards away. "The herd!" Gideon bellowed, sprinting toward the fire. "Nora, the well, the pump, get the buckets!" He was not thinking of the hay. The hay was lost. He was thinking of the animals trapped in the lower corral, their terrified, high-pitched whinnies tearing at the night. He reached the main gate, the wood already hot to the touch, and fought the heavy, warping bar. Nora's mind, frozen for a second by the sheer, terrible beauty of the blaze, snapped into focus. She ran to the hand pump, her hands finding the cold iron handle. She pumped, her body a frantic machine, throwing her weight into it until the water gushed. She filled the first bucket, the water splashing over her boots, and hauled the sloshing, heavy load toward the cabin. Not the barn. Gideon got the gate open. The small herd, half a dozen cows and their calves, stampeded out, their eyes white with terror. They thundered past him into the darkness of the basin. Storm, his prized gray, was in the attached stable, and Gideon plunged into the smoke to get him. That was when the first shot rang out. A bullet tore through the roof of the small stable, showering Gideon in splinters. Hee-haw, burn it all, boys. Vern Slater. He was silhouetted against the inferno, riding in a lazy circle, a torch in one hand and a pistol in the other. 2 other men were with him, methodically tossing flaming brands onto the roof of the cabin itself. "That's for the welcome you gave me." "Rourke," Slater yelled, firing again, this time at the water trough. Nora had just reached the cabin, tossing the first bucket of water onto a patch of burning shingles near the door. The smoke was thick, stinging her eyes, her hair already stiff with it. She saw Slater, saw the men. This was not just arson. It was an execution. Gideon burst from the stable, choking, slapping Storm's flank to send him galloping to safety. He raised his Spencer, but Slater was a moving target, dancing in the light of the fire he'd set. "Get the woman," Slater roared. "Barlow wants her first." One of the men dismounted and ran toward Nora. She threw the empty bucket at him and turned to run for the pump. He was fast, grabbing her by the arm, his hand like a steel trap. "Got you, little bird." Nora, in a motion born of pure instinct, slammed her free hand into the man's face, her fingers, still holding the small, silver-backed mirror from her scattered belonging, raked across his eyes. He howled and staggered back, clutching his face. She did not pause. She saw Slater, reloading his pistol, his face a leering, sweat-drenched mask in the firelight. She was too far from the cabin, too far from Gideon. She had no weapon, unless the fire. It was a weapon. The light. She held up the small mirror, the one she had almost thrown away. She angled it, catching the blinding glare of the main barn fire. The beam of reflected flame was intense, a focused spear of light. She flashed it directly into Slater's eyes. He bellowed in rage, blinded. "What? I can't." "Now, Gideon!" she screamed. It was all the time he needed. Gideon, no longer having to lead a target, aimed at the source of the chaos. He did not shoot the man. He shot the fire. The Spencer cracked, its report sharper than Slater's pistol. The bullet struck the oil-filled lantern hanging from Slater's saddle horn. The lantern exploded, a secondary fireball that engulfed Slater's right side, setting his duster and his horse's mane ablaze. The horse, screaming in terror and pain, reared, then bolted, a comet of fire vanishing into the night. Slater, his own arm burning, was carried with it, his curses lost to the wind. The other 2 men, seeing their leader disappear, and now facing Gideon's steady aim and Nora's strange firelight, paused. That hesitation was their undoing. The wind, which had been fanning the flames, suddenly shifted. A low, moaning sound came from the high ridges, a sound that was not the fire and not the men. "What is that?" Nora yelled, wiping her streaming eyes. Gideon looked up. "Get down! Cover your face!" A solid wall of sand, grit, and alkali dust, loosened by the fire's updraft and pushed by a sudden downdraft from the peaks, collapsed onto the basin. It was not rain. It was a suffocating, blinding storm of earth, a sand rain that the old-timers spoke of. It instantly choked the smaller fires on the cabin roof, smothered the embers. The world dissolved into a brown-black chaos of stinging grit and howling wind. The remaining 2 men, caught in the open, turned and fled, their horses struggling against the sudden, blinding curtain. The sand rain lasted only a minute, but it felt like an eternity. When it settled, the air was thick with a haze that tasted of ash and grit. The great barn was a smoking skeleton. The cabin was pocked with dirt, but it was safe, and then they heard it, a thin, terrified bleating. "The foal!" Gideon rasped, his throat raw. One of his mares had given birth 2 days prior, in the chaos. It had been separated. A section of the burning corral had collapsed, and the small creature was trapped, its leg caught under a smoldering beam. The mare, frantic, circled nearby, but was kept back by the heat. "It's too hot," Nora said, her hand to her mouth. "The beam's still burning," Gideon said. He grabbed a wet blanket from the trough. "I'll lift, you pull. Get its legs, now." They moved together. The heat was scorching. Gideon threw the blanket over his shoulders and jammed his body under the heavy, smoking wood. He heaved, his muscles straining, the veins in his neck standing out. "It's not enough," he gasped. Nora dropped to her knees, ignoring the hot ash, and plunged her arms into the darkness under the beam. She grabbed the foal's slick, trembling legs. "Pull! Gideon on 3, 1, 2, 3. She pulled, and he lifted with a roar that was more animal than human. The foal slid free. Nora rolled away, cradling the small, trembling creature. As Gideon let the beam crash back down, they knelt in the mud and ash, panting. The foal, miraculously, was unhurt. Nora was covered in soot, her hair matted with smoke, but her eyes, when she looked at Gideon, were alive. He was leaning on his knees, coughing, the sound a deep, racking bark that shook his whole frame. Their hot breath mingled in the cold, gritty air. We saved him," she whispered. "Jegsample, this is the response. This is a note." A single horseman approached, riding slow, not Slater. This one wore a star. Deputy Walt Rusk reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the devastation. He was the man from the ridge, the man who had been watching. "My goodness, Rourke," Rusk said, his voice full of a lazy, false concern. "Looks like you had a spark get loose from your chimney. Terrible tragedy." Gideon, still breathing hard, straightened up. "It was Slater, Rusk. You know it was. He set this, tried to kill us." Rusk sighed, tilting his hat back. "Now, Gideon, that's a serious accusation. Vern Slater, he's a trusted man, works for Mr. Barlow's Railroad. Why, I saw him in town not 3 hours ago, at the saloon. He couldn't have been out here." "You're a liar," Gideon said, his voice a low growl. "I'm an officer of the law," Rusk said, his eyes hardening. "And I see a burned-out barn, and a man who's known for being difficult. Seems to me you were careless. I'll have to make a report of it. You're lucky the sand rain came, or you'd have lost the cabin, too." He looked at Nora, a new, speculative gleam in his eye. "And you, ma'am, you're the scrivener, ain't you? You ought to be careful. Fire follows tinder." He tipped his hat, a mockery of politeness. "Good night, Rourke. I'd clean this up if I were you. It's an eyesore." He turned and rode off, not even bothering to look for tracks. A man with no intention of doing his job. He was clearly, hopelessly, one of them. When he was gone, the silence that fell was worse than the fire. It was the silence of utter isolation. Gideon coughed again. a deep, painful-sounding spasm. He leaned against a post, his face pale under the layers of grime. Nora approached him, her hand going to the wet rag she'd used for the pump. Without thinking, without asking, she reached up and gently, firmly, wiped a long streak of black soot from his cheek. It was a small, simple gesture, but it was the first human kindness he had felt in 2 years. He froze. His coughing stopped. He looked down at her. Her face was inches from his. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the steel. Her hand was steady on his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. Neither of them breathed. The world, which had been all fire and noise, shrank to this single point of contact, a heart, his or hers. It was impossible to tell. Skipped a beat. She pulled her hand back, as if realizing what she'd done. You were covered in soot." "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. He turned away, and the moment was broken, but it lingered, an ember in the ash. He walked to the edge of the burned-out perimeter, his eyes scanning the mud created by the spilled water and the sand. "He's right about one thing. I should clean this up." He knelt, his gaze fixed on the ground, not where the fire had been, but where the attackers had ridden. The sand rain had not erased everything. "Nora, bring the light." She fetched a lantern from the cabin. He held it low, illuminating a set of tracks, different from the hoof prints. "Wheel ruts," she said. "Too wide for a buckboard," Gideon said, his finger tracing the impression. "And deep. They were carrying something heavy." He stood, following the tracks with his eyes. They led not toward town, not toward the pass, but east, toward the low, flat-topped mesas. "Where do they go?" she asked. Gideon was silent for a long moment, staring into the darkness. "To Barlow's brickyard. It's been defunct for 5 years. No one goes out there." "They do," Nora said. "They left the foal with its mother and rode. Gideon on Storm, Nora on the mule. They rode for an hour. The brickyard's ruined kilns rising like ancient, broken teeth against the pre-dawn sky. They found the wagon, hidden in a dry arroyo, and they found the cargo. It was not bricks. "Dynamite," Gideon whispered, his hand resting on one of the dozen crates. "Enough to level a mountain, or a rail spur, or a town," Nora said. She looked at the crates, then at the tracks leading back toward her new map in the cabin. "It's for the railroad, for his bloodline." They returned to the cabin as the first hint of gray light touched the sky. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only a cold, bone-deep weariness and a harder resolve. Nora went straight to the table. She uncorked the new bottle of India ink. She dipped her finest quill. She pulled out the map of the basin. With precise, steady strokes, she drew the path of the railroad, from the brickyard, straight through the basin, cutting off the creek. She drew it not in black, but in a deep, bright red. "You called it a bloodline," Gideon said, watching her. "That's what it is," she said. "Built on the water he's stealing and the lives he's taken. It stops here." "How?" Gideon said, gesturing to the ruined barn. We just survived. Nora, we didn't win. They'll be back." "I know." She looked up, her face set. "If we do this right, Gideon, the people will see. They'll see the dynamite, the false ledger, the murders. They'll have to—" Gideon ran a hand over his face, wiping away the last of the grit. "And if we're wrong, if we do this and they don't see, or they don't care," Nora's eyes met his. "And if we're wrong, we'll be buried at Devil's Notch. This time, for good." She capped the red ink. "They'll be back, but they'll be smarter. They won't use fire. They'll try to discredit us. They'll try to paint you as the criminal." "Slater left one of his men in town," Gideon said. "Rusk gave him an alibi. Then we have to break that alibi," Nora said, her mind working, the pieces clicking into place. "We need to make Slater commit a crime, a public crime, in front of witnesses Rusk can't ignore. He's not stupid," Gideon said. "No," Nora agreed. "But he's arrogant, and he's greedy." She began to rummage in her supplies. "Ranchers buy salt, don't they, for their cattle? Alma Heath sells it, 20-pound sacks. Then, Nora said, pulling out an empty burlap sack. We're going to make a salt shipment. She walked to the door and scooped up a handful of the fine, dark gravel from the wash. This looks like salt. In the dark, but we'll mark it. A single drop of red ink on every 10th stone. Gideon began to understand. A trap. A public one, she said. We'll let the rumor slip that I'm riding to Alma's late tonight with my payment for her help. Payment in salt, the one thing everyone needs. Slater's man will hear it. He'll try to steal it, and when he's caught, in front of the whole town, with a bag of marked rocks, even Deputy Russ can't call gravel salt. It was a desperate, flimsy plan. It relied on rumor, on greed, and on the steady nerves of a woman who had, until 3 days ago, never held a gun. It was all they had. As the first weak rays of the morning sun illuminated the wreckage of the barn, Gideon looked at the cabin, the fire, the sand, the fight. It had all left its mark. The front door, which he always kept barred and bolted, had been kicked by one of the men. It was slightly off its hinges, hanging just a fraction of an inch open. It hung there in the gray light, ajar, like a watchful, wounded eye, waiting for what came next. The day after the fire was a new kind of hell. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind the stink of wet ash, the taste of grit, and a bone-deep exhaustion that felt like a shroud. The burned-out skeleton of the barn stood against the gray morning sky, a monument to their vulnerability. Nora was running on fumes, her body vibrating with a low, thrumming energy that was part rage, part terror. By midday, it betrayed her. The vibration became a visible tremor, and a feverish flush bloomed on her cheeks. A delayed reaction to the smoke, the fear, and the chilling cold of the night. She insisted she was fine, that she was helping Gideon sift through the salvageable tools, but her hands fumbled, and when she stood up too fast from examining a warped piece of iron, the world went gray at the edges. Enough! Gideon's voice was not harsh, but it was absolute. He took the piece of metal from her hand, his calloused fingers brushing her own, which were hot to the touch. You're done. He led her back to the cabin, not asking, but steering her by the elbow. He sat her on the settee, the one she had first woken up on, what felt like a lifetime ago. She started to protest, to say there was too much to do, but a dry, racking cough cut her off. He said nothing. He simply went to the stove, took a tin from the shelf, a tin Eliza had once kept, and measured out a small handful of dried wildflowers, chamomile. He heated the water, his movements economical and practiced. He was a man used to taking care of himself, of performing the small rituals of survival in a house empty of comfort. He brought her the steaming tin cup. The scent was sweet, dusty, and calming. She took it, her hands shaking so much the tea sloshed. I am not weak, she whispered, angry at her own body. No one said you were, Gideon replied, pulling up one of the rough kitchen chairs and sitting a few feet away. Not too close, but not abandoning her. He did not busy himself. He did not clean his rifle or sharpen a tool. He just sat, waiting, offering the one thing he had in abundance, a stubborn, silent presence. The silence, combined with the warm tea and the sudden cessation of all demands, broke something in her. The dam of her composure, held in place for years, finally cracked. They used to lock me in a closet, she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. Gideon's posture did not change. He just watched her. At the orphanage, in St. Louis, when I was too small to be useful, or when I asked too many questions. It was dark, and the air was small. I couldn't breathe. I learned to be quiet. I learned to make myself small, to disappear. She stared into the tin cup, her reflection a warped, pale oval. Then one day, the matron needed a letter written. She had a boil on her hand. She said she was angry. I told her I could. I had taught myself to read from thrown-away newspapers. I taught myself to write by copying the labels on medicine bottles. I was 6 years old. She sipped the tea. It was scalding, but it grounded her. The letters, the ink, it was the first thing that was ever mine. I was good at it. When I wrote, I wasn't an orphan. I was a conduit. I was the one who could make the marks that meant something. The marks that were clean and ordered and made sense when nothing else did. My penmanship. My trade. It saved me. It got me out. It was the only thing that kept me from being hungry or cold or locked in the dark. She looked at him, her eyes bright with fever and unshed tears. And Slater, at the notch, he took my papers, my letters of introduction, my references. He crumpled them. He threw them in the dirt like they were trash. He tried to make me small again. He tried to put me back in the dark, in a grave. Gideon sat forward. He did not offer empty comfort. He did not say, "It will be all right." He just listened, his gaze so intent it was almost a physical touch. He had heard her entire confession, a story she had never told another living soul. He had taken the weight of it, and he had not buckled. He was about to speak when the world outside changed. The gray light in the cabin suddenly turned a sickly, sulphurous yellow. A low moan began, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was not the high-pitched yelp of a coyote, but a deep, thoracic roar. Gideon was on his feet in a second, moving to the window. "Dust storm, a bad one. It's coming down from the ridge." Before he had even finished the sentence, it hit. The cabin was struck by a physical force, as if a giant's hand had slammed against the walls. The wind did not just howl, it screamed. And with it came the sand, a million tiny, stinging bullets scouring the wood, finding every crack. The air in the room thickened, the yellow light turning to a claustrophobic, gritty brown. The sound was deafening, the rattling of the windows, the roar of the wind, and a new, terrible sound, the heavy thud-thud-thud of the damaged front door, the one hanging ajar, as the storm tried to rip it from its hinges. "The door won't hold," Gideon yelled over the din. "It'll tear the whole frame out. We have to get out of here." Out where?" Nora cried, her voice thin with panic. "The shed. The tool shed." "It's stone. It'll hold. Grab the blankets." He snatched his rifle. A jug of water. And the lantern. Nora grabbed the wool blankets from the cot. He unbarred the back door, the one that faced away from the wind, and shoved it open. The wind tore the door from his hand, slamming it against the outer wall with a crack. He grabbed Nora's arm. "Keep your head down. Don't breathe deep." They plunged into the swirling brown chaos. It was not air. It was a solid, moving thing. The world was gone. There was no sky, no ground, only the stinging, suffocating force of the storm. Nora would have been blown off her feet, but Gideon's grip was an iron anchor. He half-dragged, half-carried her the 20 yards to the small, low structure he had built into the side of a rise. He kicked the heavy wooden door open, shoved her inside, and then threw his entire body weight against the door to close it. Fighting the suction of the wind, he dropped the bar into place. Silence. The silence was sudden and shocking. The roar was gone, replaced by a deep, muffled whoomph as the storm raged outside, its voice now muted by 6 inches of wood and 2 feet of stone. They were in near total darkness. The only light was a thin line of brown dust puffing in rhythmically from under the door. The only sound was their own ragged, desperate breathing. Gideon fumbled with the lantern, his hands scraping against the flint. A spark, another, and then a weak yellow flame caught. He set the lantern on a workbench. The shed was small, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. It smelled of earth, cold iron, and axle grease. Tools lined the walls, casting long, strange shadows. Their own shadows were huge, looming against the stone wall. As they stood, catching their breath, their shadows, magnified and distorted by the lantern, reached out and touched. They merged, becoming one single, dark shape, long before their bodies did. Nora sank onto a low stool, her body trembling. The fever, the fear, the sudden, violent transition from the fire to the dark. It was too much. She began to shiver. Gideon spread one of the blankets over a pile of burlap sacks. Sit here. It's cleaner." He helped her up, and she sat, pulling the other blanket around her shoulders. He remained standing, his back to the door, listening. The door rattled in its frame, a constant, nervous shudder. The dust was still coming in under the sill, a tiny, unstoppable invasion. Nora watched him. He was a statue, his shoulders set, the Spencer rifle held loosely in one hand. He was a man made for vigilance, for enduring. Her eyes drifted to his hand, the one not holding the rifle. It was resting on a workbench. The lantern light caught a pale, silvery mark on his wrist, a jagged line that snaked from his pulse to his forearm. It was a scar, a terrible one. It looked like a map of a dried-up river. Without thinking, driven by the strange intimacy of the storm, she reached out. She did not touch him, not yet. She just gestured. What happened there?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked down at his wrist, as if surprised to see it. He had worn the scar for so long he had forgotten it. "Barbed wire," he said, his voice quiet. "Back in. Must be 10 years ago. Before Eliza, I was stringing a fence line on the North Ridge. Alone. A post snapped. The wire. It recoiled. Caught me." He flexed his hand, the scar tissue pulling tight. Nora, her hand still hovering, moved closer. She gently laid her fingers on the scar. His skin was warm, calloused, but he flinched. A tiny, involuntary muscle spasm. She did not pull away. She just let her hand rest there, her touch light as a moth. It must have hurt terribly," she whispered. He looked at her hand on his wrist. He did not pull away. "It did," he said. "But that's not the one I feel." He turned his hand over, his fingers grazing her palm. He did not hold her hand. He just met it. "Eliza's been gone for 2 years," he said, his voice thick, the words coming hard, as if he were pulling them up from a deep, cold well. "And every morning, I wake up, and for a second, just 1 second, I forget, I see the sun hit the dust on the windowsill, and I think, I'll get up and she'll be at the stove." He looked at Nora, his eyes full of a pain so vast and arid it mirrored the desert outside. "And then I remember, and the whole day is just about getting to the night, so I can sleep, so I can forget again." He finally looked away, back at the door. "When she died, I didn't just lose her. I lost the part of me that could, I'm afraid, Scrivener. Afraid of Slater." "No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm afraid of this. Afraid of feeling anything. Afraid of wanting to see the morning again. Because this world, it just takes it all. And I can't bury anyone else. Nora, I can't." It was the most he had ever said. It was a confession of a fear deeper than any grave. She moved from the stool, standing in front of him. The space between them was electric, charged with the roar of the storm outside and the quiet, desperate thunder of his words. She did not take her hand from his wrist. They just looked at each other for a long, long time. The lantern flame guttered, casting shadows that danced across his face. She saw the lines of pain, the exhaustion, and the deep, deep loneliness. And she saw the man who had ridden between her and a bullet, the man who had made her tea, the man who had just shown her his most profound scar. He looked at her, at the smudges of soot on her cheek, the fever-bright eyes, the set of her jaw that was the strongest thing he had ever seen. His gaze dropped to her lips, just for a second, then back to her eyes. "Nora," he rasped, and her name on his lips was its own kind of touch. "If you'll let me." He did not finish. He did not have to. He was asking for permission. He was giving her the choice that Slater, that Barlow, that the whole world had tried to take from her. She gave her answer without a word. She just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. His hand, the one that wasn't scarred, came up. It did not grab. It did not take. It rested, gently, on her shoulder. His other hand, the one she was still touching. He turned, and his fingers finally, gently, intertwined with hers. The first kiss was not a kiss of passion. It was a question. It was clumsy, hesitant, a simple, dry press of his lips to hers. It was two broken, practical people, fumbling in the dark. He tasted of dust and coffee, and a deep, surprising warmth. She did not pull back. She leaned into it, a fraction of an inch. His hand on her shoulder moved up, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw, his touch impossibly tender for a man with so much iron in him. He tilted her chin, and this time, the kiss was not a question. It was an answer. It was warm, and it was deep, and it was slow. It was the end of a long, cold winter. His lips were chapped, like hers, but they were soft, and he kissed her as if he were drinking water after a lifetime of thirst. Her hand, the one not holding his, came up and rested on his chest. She could feel his heart, a heavy, frantic thump, 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 beating against her palm, as fast as her own. His breath, warm and ragged, hitched in his throat, her own breathing. She had forgotten to. She let it out in a small sigh that he swallowed. He pulled back, just enough to rest his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. His hand was no longer on her shoulder, but had moved to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the gritty, smoke-stiffened hair at her nape. They stood like that, foreheads touching, sharing the same small, warm pocket of air. The world outside roared. The door rattled. But in the 10-by-10-foot stone shed, there was a profound, absolute stillness. "I'm here," he whispered, his breath fanning her face. "Me too." She breathed back. They did not move for a long time. The kiss was over, but the connection it had forged remained. A tangible thing. Slowly, the roaring of the wind began to subside. The screaming turned to a moan, the moan to a sigh, and then, finally, to silence. The only sound was the faint tink-tink-tink of sand settling on the roof. The storm had passed. Gideon was the first to pull back. Though his hand remained on her neck, he looked different. The hard, flat calm was gone. In its place was something raw and open and terribly real. Nora leaned her head against his chest. Just for a moment, she heard the steady, solid beat of his heart under her ear, the rhythm returning to normal. It was the sound of life. It was the sound of here. This doesn't change the plan," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. He put his other arm around her, holding her. "No, but Barlow, Slater, they think this, feelings," she struggled for the word. "They think it makes people weak, something to exploit." He held her tighter. "It doesn't make me feel weak, Nora. It makes me feel angry. It makes me feel strong. It's not something to lose. It's something to protect." She looked up at him. "To protect the innocent. To protect us," he corrected her, his voice fierce. She nodded. They were in agreement. This was not a surrender. It was an alliance, forged in fire, sealed in shadow. She stepped back. The domestic, practical part of her, the scrivener who loved order, took over. His coat, a heavy canvas duster, was unlaced at the collar. She reached up, her fingers, which had been in his hair, now deftly, methodically, took the leather lace and tied it. She fastened the top button, a small, ritualistic gesture of setting things right, of preparing for the next battle. He let her. He watched her face as she did it, her expression serious, her brow furrowed in concentration, as if she were balancing a ledger. When she was done, she smoothed the front of his coat with her palms, a gesture that was almost wifely. "We should go," she said. "See the damage." He nodded and picked up the lantern. Miles away, on the far side of the basin, the storm had been just as fierce. Vern Slater, his arm in a crude, burned sling, lowered a brass spyglass. He had been watching the ranch, had seen the two figures run from the cabin to the shed. He had watched the shed for 2 hours. They had not come out. Now. He watched as the door opened. and the two figures emerged into the sand-scoured, clean air. They stood closer than before. Slater spat into the dust. He turned to the man beside him, the one with the military boots. They're holed up, think they're safe, think they're smart. He squinted at the cabin. It's time. Go back to Barlow. Tell him to prepare the final message, the one for the auction, the one they can't ignore. The town square of Cinder Hollow was not a square so much as a wide, dusty street between the saloon and the general store. But today, it was a theater, a rickety wooden platform, normally used for hanging announcements or selling livestock, had been designated for the auction. Atop it stood two men. One was Sheriff Ambrose Kit, his belly straining his tin star, his hand resting on a gavel as if it were a pistol. The other was Mr. Barlow, a man Nora had only seen in her ledgers. He was immaculate, dressed in a black frock coat and a boiled shirt, a stark, clean parasite against the dusty, sun-baked town. His face was pale, his eyes were dead, and he was smiling. The crowd was thick, ranchers in threadbare dusters, miners with coal dust in their creases, townsfolk, wives, and children. They were here out of fear, out of curiosity, out of a desperate hope that the auction of Gideon Rourke's delinquent land was not the harbinger of their own. "We begin in 5 minutes," Sheriff Kit announced, his voice a self-important boom. "The public auction of the Larkspur Basin property, seized for taxes and public disturbance." This was the opening. It was now or never. "Gideon," Nora whispered, her hand on the leather tube she carried. Gideon, standing beside her at the edge of the crowd, simply nodded. He was carrying his own rolled-up map. Before anyone could stop her, Nora Lark, a small, soot-stained woman no one recognized, walked out of the crowd. She did not approach the platform. She climbed onto the back of a flatbed freight wagon that sat abandoned nearby, its bed at the perfect height. She was now eye-level with Barlow. A murmur went through the crowd. Who was this Sheriff Kit? Nora's voice was not loud, but it was clear. It was the voice of a scrivener, trained to be precise, and it cut through the dusty air. "You cannot auction this land, because you are not a sheriff. You are an accomplice." The crowd went utterly silent. Barlow's smile did not falter, but his eyes, dead a moment before, fixed on her. "And you, Mr. Barlow," Nora continued, her hands shaking, but her voice holding steady. "You cannot buy this land, because you have already paid for it. With the lives of our citizens." She unrolled the first document, the copied ledger. "I am Nora Lark. I am a scrivener, and I have here a copy of Mr. Barlow's private ledger, a list of fees, transport fees for medicine that never arrived, fees that left families broke and left their sick to die." A great collective "oh" rose from the crowd. This was more than they had expected. "This is the list of the dead," she cried, her voice rising. "Henry Pearson's wife, the Miller twins, and 12 others all dead because of a fee." Barlow stepped forward, his smile now a cold, reptilian line. "Sheriff, who is this person, this parasite? She is clearly hysterical. She is waving around what is, obviously, a poorly forged document." He turned his gaze on Nora, his voice like silk dipped in venom. "You, madam, are a forger, a liar. I have no doubt you are working with the delinquent Rourke. By the time I am done with you, you will be in a cell in Prescott for libel, for conspiracy. You will not see the sun for 10 years. Get her down from there," Sheriff Barlow commanded. Sheriff Kit, his face purple, fumbled for his pistol. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for disturbing the peace." Am I?" Nora's voice was sharp. She held up the second document. It was not a ledger. It was a letter. Its paper yellowed, its ink faded. "Then you must also arrest the late Dr. Miles, because this is his letter, attesting that he never received a single dollar of your fees. And you must also arrest the Yavapai County magistrate, because this," she held up the third paper, "is his signed decree from 1884, stating that all medical transport on that rail line is to be, and I quote, free and clear of all encumbrance. The crowd gasped. This was not rumor. This was paper. This was the law. "She's right," a woman in the crowd shouted. My boy, he was on that list." "It's true," another man yelled. "Barlow said it was a federal tax. He's a thief." The square was turning. The theater was becoming a courtroom. Barlow's face was white. He had not expected this. He had not expected proof. "And he's not just a thief." Gideon Rourke's deep voice boomed. He had moved from the crowd, and he was now at the other end of the wagon, unrolling his own map. The map, the one with the angry red line. He held it up, a massive, hand-drawn map of the entire basin. "He's not just taking your money," Gideon said, his voice reaching every corner. "He is taking your water." He pointed to the red line. "This is his new rail spur, the one he is building with the dynamite he has hidden at the old brickyard. It's not for passengers. It's for ore, and it is going to cut the creek. It is going to sever the main aquifer." He looked at the ranchers, at the farmers, his people. "He's not just drying me out. He is going to turn this entire valley, your farms, your ranches, into a desert. And then he will buy it from you for nothing." The crowd, which had been murmuring, was now a low, angry roar. This was not about the past, about dead relatives. This was about their future, their children, their survival. "Lies!" Sheriff Kit shrieked, his authority evaporating. These are desperate lies. Arrest them both." He drew his pistol and pointed it at Nora. "Gideon!" Nora screamed. Gideon moved, but not to his gun. He stepped directly in front of Nora, his body shielding hers. He was between her and the pistol, just as he had been at Devil's Notch. But this time, he did something that stunned the entire square into silence. He unbuckled his holster. He let the heavy rig, his Spencer, his only defense, fall to the ground with a heavy, dusty thud. He raised his hands, empty, palms out, for all to see. He stared at Ambrose Kit. "Go on, Sheriff," Gideon said, his voice a low, powerful challenge that only those nearby could hear, but everyone could understand. "If justice is real, you don't need a gun to stop the truth. But if it's not, you'll have to shoot an unarmed man in front of this whole town." It was a perfect, terrible checkmate. Deputy Walt Rusk, who had been standing near the platform, looked at Kit, then at Gideon's empty hands. He looked at the crowd, at their angry, accusing faces. He put his hand on his own pistol, but he did not draw. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, the town spoke. "He's right." A loud, clear voice came from the crowd. Alma Heath, the blacksmith, her face streaked with forge soot, pushed her way to the front. She held up one of Barlow's false invoices. "I'm a blacksmith. I know weight, and I know a man's thumbprint. That's my print on this weight ticket. And that's not my print on Barlow's invoice. This is a forgery." "Mine too," another rancher shouted, holding up his own papers. "He's been robbing us all." The crowd surged forward, a wave of anger directed at the platform. They were no longer spectators. They were a mob. Barlow, seeing the tide turn with a speed that terrified him, looked at his hired gun, who had been lingering by the saloon. Vern Slater, his arm in a dirty sling, saw his boss's nod. This was no longer a legal fight. He drew his pistol and fired a single shot into the air. The crack of the gunshot was deafening. The crowd screamed. They scrambled back, pushing, falling over each other. Chaos erupted. In that single perfect moment of panic, Sheriff Kit, his face a mask of sweat and terror, did what he had always done. He followed orders. He pulled the trigger, aiming not at Gideon, but at the woman, the scrivener, the source of it all. "Nora!" Gideon roared. He did not have his gun. He could not shoot back. He could only shove. He threw his entire body into Nora, pushing her off the wagon bed, just as the bullet tore the air where she had been standing. The bullet struck the heavy wooden post of the wagon's headboard, a thwack of splintering wood. Gideon landed hard on top of her in the dust. The wind knocked out of them both. The crowd was screaming. From the abandoned church at the end of the street, someone, woken by the shot, began to frantically ring the town bell. Clang, clang, clang. An alarm, an invasion. The sound of a town breaking. "It's a riot," Sheriff Kit yelled, his voice cracking. "It's an insurrection. I am declaring this auction postponed. This gathering is illegal. Disperse, by order of the law." He and Barlow scrambled off the back of the platform, their own men, including Deputy Rusk, forming a protective circle around them. The square was a mess of panicked people, shouting, running. Gideon pulled Nora to her feet. "Are you hit?" "No," she gasped, her ears ringing. You saved me." "It's not over," he said, pulling her through the chaos, toward the alleyway. A figure stepped from the smoke. Vern Slater. He was not looking at them. He was just part of the fleeing crowd, but as he passed, he leaned in close to Nora, his voice a sibilant, venomous whisper, his breath hot and foul. "You should have stayed in the grave, little bird. The paper's no good now. It's just blood." He grinned, his teeth yellow. "Tonight, Devil's Notch, where it all started, it ends." He melted back into the crowd, leaving them alone. The echo of the church bell and the promise of a final, terrible confrontation ringing in their ears. The chaos of the square was the perfect cover. Slater's whispered threat was not a period. It was a contract, and Nora knew it. "He set a trap," she said to Gideon as they cut through the alley, the ringing of the church bell fading behind them. "And he expects me to be the bait." "He's not trapping you," Gideon said, his face grim as he pulled her behind the tannery, the smell of chemicals and hide sharp in the air. "He's trapping me. He knows I'll follow. He wants us both at the Notch. No witnesses." "I know," Nora said, her voice low and steady, all the tremor gone. "And that's our advantage. He thinks he's writing this story, but he's not." She looked up at him, her eyes dark in the twilight. "He doesn't know what's real and what's a decoy. The ledger at the church." Gideon understood. "The real one is safe. The one under the stone, the decoy. That's what he'll be looking for." She pressed a small canvas bag into his hand. It was heavy, full of the smooth, round gravel from the basin wash, the one she had marked with red ink. "This isn't desert code. This is a scrivener's code. Every 50 paces, on the right side of the trail. I won't make it easy for him to see." "Nora," he said, his voice rough. This is too much. Let me face him." "No, he doesn't want you. He wants me. You are just the obstacle. But I am the prize. He thinks he can kidnap me from the edge of town, where I'll be fleeing to Alma's." "He'll make it look like I ran, and you chased." She took a deep breath. "And I'll let him. You follow, but you don't come for me. You come for them. I am not letting you go alone." His grip on her arm was iron. "You won't be," she said. "You'll be right behind me, and Alma. She's already rounding them up, the ranchers, the ones who had their invoices changed. They'll be at the Notch. They'll be the witnesses this time." It was a desperate, terrible plan, built on paper, gravel, and the arrogance of a hired gun. An hour later, as the last light bled from the sky, Nora Lark was riding the mule, her decoy papers stuffed in a saddlebag, on the trail out of Cinder Hollow. As she passed the last homestead, two riders burst from a dry wash. It was Slater and the man with the military boots. They did not fire. They simply flanked her. Well, little bird," Slater sneered, his burned arm glowing with a dull, painful red in the dusk. "Flying the coop? Barlow's gonna be so pleased you saved us the trouble of finding you." He grabbed the mule's rein. "Get moving. We've got a hole to finish digging." Nora did not scream. She did not fight. She just let her hand, the one in her pocket, open, and the first red-marked pebble fell silently to the dust. Gideon found it 10 minutes later, a tiny speck of crimson in the moonlight. He was not alone. He was on Storm, but behind him, moving like shadows through the rocks, were Alma Heath and 4 other ranchers, their faces set, their rifles ready. Devil's Notch was a different place at night. The shadows were absolute, the cliffs like the walls of a great, open tomb. A single lantern burned, casting a sickly yellow circle of light on the very spot where Nora had been forced to dig before. The shovel was there. "Go on," Slater ordered, shoving her toward it. "Pick it up. You know the work." Nora looked at him. She looked at the hole, still shallow, a scar from days before. She looked at the man with the military boots, who was standing back, rifle cradled, watching. She picked up the shovel. "You know," she said, her voice conversational, as if she were at a tea party, "this land, it's interesting, geologically." Slater, who had been expecting tears, just stared. "What? Shut up and dig." Nora put the spade to the earth. "Scrape." "It's all sedimentary, Triassic. I'd wager." "Scrape. But this part of the cliff, this is different. It's limestone. You can see the fossils. It tells a story." "What in the hell are you babbling about?" Slater growled, his patience already thin. Snapping. "I'm talking about history," Nora said, pausing to lean on the shovel. "About what lasts. This rock was here for 1,000,000 years. It holds the memory of the water that put it here. You can't erase that. You can only dig it up." Slater was unnerved. This small, terrified woman was gone. In her place was a stranger, lecturing him on rocks. I said dig," he yelled, raising his hand. "That's quite enough of that. Vern!" A third man stepped into the lantern light. Sheriff Ambrose Kit. He was not in his uniform. He was in a trail duster, his face slick with sweat. Sheriff Slater was confused. "What are you doing here?" "Making it legal," Kit said, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket. He uncorked a small inkwell, produced a pen, and knelt, using his knee as a desk. "Barlow wants this clean. No loose ends. I'm just signing the seizure order. Larkspur Basin Ranch, seized in the interest of public safety, due to the riot started by its owner." He signed it with a flourish. "There, now, Gideon Rourke is officially a trespasser. When he shows up, and you know he will, you can shoot him legally. As for her," he looked at Nora with undisguised contempt. "She's an accomplice, resisting arrest, tragic. This was the true face of the law. Not just corrupt, but petty, bureaucratic, and evil." "So, dig," Kit said, his voice flat. "And be quick about it. Rusk is supposed to meet us here. We need to finalize the paperwork with him, too." On the ridge, 200 yards above them, Gideon heard every word. He lay flat on the rock, his spyglass trained on the scene. He saw Nora, her face pale but composed. He saw Kit, signing the paper. And he saw Rusk, the deputy, approaching from the other side of the pass, unaware of what he was walking into. Gideon looked at Alma Heath beside him. She was holding a small, silver-backed mirror, his mirror. "Now," she whispered. "Not yet," Gideon said. "Wait for Rusk. He needs to see this." Rusk rode in, his face uneasy. "Sheriff Slater, what is this? I got your message." "Ah, Walter," Kit said, standing up, his tone oily. "You're just in time. We've had a terrible situation. This woman, she attacked Mr. Slater, and Rourke, well, he's gone mad. We're here to contain the situation." "Contain it," Rusk said, his eyes falling on Nora, on the shovel, on the open grave. What are you doing?" "What needs to be done," Slater said, his patience gone. "Barlow pays us to fix problems. Rusk, and you, me, and the sheriff. We're the last ones who know all the details. Barlow likes that. He wants all the fixers in one place." Rusk's blood went cold. What do you mean?" "He means," Kit said, his voice cold, "that this is your last official act, deputy, a hero's death, trying to stop the fugitive Rourke. Such a shame. You, her, and Rourke, all in one neat, tragic hole." Rusk finally understood. He was not an accomplice. He was a loose end. He had been demoted from crony to victim. His hand slowly, almost imperceptibly, moved toward his holster, on the ridge. Gideon spoke. "Now, Alma, now." Alma raised the mirror. She did not aim it at the men. She aimed it at the lantern, the one sitting on a rock near Slater. She angled it, catching the light, and flashed it once, twice, 3 times, toward the cliffs on the opposite side, where the other ranchers were hidden. It was the signal. Slater, his eyes animal-sharp, caught the movement. "What in the—" He looked up, squinting. "Who's up there?" "It's Rourke," Kit shrieked, drawing his pistol and firing wildly into the darkness. "It's a trick," Nora shouted, and with a speed that shocked them all. She scooped up the metal lid from her canteen. She flung it, not at Slater, but at the lantern. Her aim was true. The lid struck the glass globe with a tink. The lantern, unbalanced, toppled over. Hot oil spilled onto the limestone, and with a whoosh, the dry lichen and brush at Slater's feet erupted in a flash of bright, white-hot flame. Slater yelled, stumbling back from the fire, his boots slipping on the loose gravel. He lost his footing, and in that moment, a voice, a deep, solid roar, came from the darkness, from the rock itself. "That's far enough." Gideon Rourke stepped into the firelight, his Spencer rifle leveled. He was not alone. From the rocks above, from all sides, Alma, Heath, and the ranchers emerged, their rifles all clicking, all aimed. "Drop it, Kit," Gideon commanded. The night exploded. Kit, in a panic, fired at Gideon. Gideon fired back, not at the man, but at the ground by his feet. The bullet ricocheting with a scream. Slater, recovering, dove for the shadows. Rolling into a deep crevice in the rock, the man with the military boots raised his rifle, aiming at the ranchers. But Walt Rusk, the deputy, the man who had been a coward for a year, had finally made his choice. He drew his pistol, but he did not aim at the ranchers. He aimed at his boss. "No, Sheriff," Rusk said, his voice shaking but clear. "No more." He fired. The bullet tore through Kit's gun hand. The sheriff screamed, a high, thin sound, as his pistol clattered to the rocks. The firefight was over in a second. But Slater was gone. "He's in the rocks!" Gideon yelled. "Reloading!" "No," Nora said, her voice tight. She had picked up a coiled rein that had fallen from Slater's horse. "He's mine." She ran, not to Gideon, but toward the crevice, into the darkness. "Nora!" Gideon roared, terrified. She ignored him. She saw Slater, his bad arm making him slow, trying to climb up the other side. He was trapped. "Little bird," he spat, fumbling for his pistol with his good hand. "I'll kill you." Nora did not stop. She was a scrivener. She was precise. She ran at him, but at the last second, she veered, using the rock wall as a brace. She did not try to fight him. She used the rein. She whipped the coiled leather, not at his face, but at his wrist. The heavy brass clasp caught, the leather strap looping, tangling. She did not wait. She set her feet, gripped the leather, and pulled. Slater, already unbalanced, his arm on fire, his good hand tangled, was yanked backward. He fell from the crevice, crashing hard onto the stone, his head striking the rock with a sickening thud. He was not dead, but he was done. Nora, panting, her entire body shaking, wrapped the rein around his wrists, tying the knot she had practiced on Gideon's saddle. Tight, secure, final. In the clearing, the ranchers had surrounded the wounded sheriff. Alma Heath, her face grim, held a torch. She shoved Kit to his knees. The light illuminated his face, not as a man of the law, but as a trapped, sniveling, corrupt thing. It was Barlow. Kit wept, cradling his shattered hand. It was always Barlow. The smoke from the guns and the flash fire hung in the air, smelling of sulfur and sage. The battle was over. Gideon stood, his rifle still raised, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would break his ribs. He had not moved, had not taken his eyes off the crevice. Nora walked out of the shadows. the end of the rein in her hand, dragging a bound and groaning Vern Slater. She was covered in dust, her hair was wild, and she was alive. She let the rein drop and looked at him. Gideon's rifle lowered. He took a step, and then another. He opened his arms. She walked into them, and he crushed her to his chest. He could feel her shaking, or maybe he was the one shaking. It did not matter. Her hands, small and strong, gripped the back of his coat. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the smell of smoke, dust, and her. They just stood there, two small figures in a vast, dark pass, surrounded by the smell of gunfire, holding each other up. They were still standing. The silence that followed the fight was a living thing, broken only by the whimpering of Sheriff Kit and the ragged breathing of the men who held him. Gideon's embrace, tight and grounding, was shattered by a new sound. It was the confident, steady clatter of multiple horses and, impossibly, the rattle of a buggy. Gideon released Nora, stepping in front of her. The Spencer coming back up. The ranchers turned, their rifles finding new targets. From the pass, not one, but 4 men emerged. 2 were hired guns, their hands hovering near new holsters. The third man was the one with the military boots, the one who had been at the ranch, and the man in the lead, stepping down from a smart, black buggy as if arriving at a bank, was Barlow. He was immaculate, his frock coat untouched by the dust. He looked at the scene at Kit, bloody and on his knees, at Slater, bound and unconscious, at the ring of armed, furious ranchers, and he smiled. It was a thin, cold smile of a man who held all the cards. "My goodness, Sheriff," Barlow said, his voice smooth and conversational. "It appears you have made a thorough mess of things. Such incompetence." He paid no mind to the rifles aimed at him. He turned to the man with the military boots. "Mr. Vance, your report." "They resisted, sir," Vance said, his voice flat. "The woman, the man, and these," he gestured to the ranchers. "Yes, it seems they have," Barlow said. "Bored." He took a leather satchel from Vance. "But it's all irrelevant." He pulled a leather tube from the bag. The decoy tube. The one Nora had planted in the church. "My man Vance, here, is far more thorough than Mr. Slater. He suspected a trick. He found this, planted, in the old mission, a laughable decoy." He then pulled out the decoy ledger itself. "And this, the forgery you so proudly displayed in the square." He held it up. "I have the evidence. I have the forgery. I have the sheriff, who will testify you created a riot, and I have you." He looked at Nora, his dead eyes appraising. "It is over, Miss Lark. You have nothing." "You're wrong," Nora's voice said, clear and cold, stepping out from behind Gideon. "You have my decoy. You have my trap. You have nothing." Barlow's smile faltered. Nora turned, not to Barlow, but to the ranchers, to Alma, to the men who stood in the torchlight. "He thinks he is the law. He thinks a piece of paper signed by that," she pointed to Kit, "is justice. It is not. We are the justice. This is the courtroom. Then let's have a trial." Alma Heath's voice was a raw shout. "Let's have it right now." "Indeed," Nora said. She turned her gaze on the one man who stood between two worlds, the man whose loyalty had been bought and betrayed. "Mr. Rusk, you are still a deputy. You are, at this moment, the only true law in this pass." Walt Rusk, pale and shaking, looked at the ring of faces. He looked at Barlow, who was now watching him with cold fury. He looked at Gideon, who gave him a single, sharp nod. Rusk took a deep breath. He holstered his pistol. He stepped into the center of the clearing. This is a public inquiry," he said, his voice finding a strength he never knew he had. "By the authority of Yavapai County, this court is in session. Ma'am, present your case." "What foolishness is this?" Barlow began. "Silence." Gideon's voice was a roar. "Let her speak." Barlow's hired guns, seeing a dozen rifles aimed at their chests, raised their hands slowly. "You're a man of paper, Mr. Barlow," Nora said, her voice steady. You live by the ledger. You believe if it is not written, it is not real. You believe you destroyed all the proof." "I did," he hissed. "You destroyed the copies. You destroyed the decoys, but you missed the original." She knelt, not to her bag, not to her pocket. She reached down to the heel of her sturdy boot. With her nail, she caught a tiny, hidden seam in the leather. It pulled away, revealing a small, hollowed-out space. From it, she pulled a single, tightly folded piece of waxed paper. It was blackened. "You believe in ledgers," she said, unfolding it. "But I believe in the machine." A locomotive engineer's log, a rail yard's transport stamp. She held up the wax paper. It was a graphite rubbing, a perfect, undeniable copy of the official transport seal from the Prescott Yard, the one used on every single freight waybill. "This is the seal from the waybill for the fever serum, the one for Eliza Rourke, the one for the Miller twins. And look, the date, October 3rd, 1884, at 9 in the morning. She then pulled a second, small paper from her other boot. "And this is a copy of the locomotive engineer's log, the one he keeps for the company. It lists the cargo, medical, 1 crate. Arrival time October 3rd, 1884, 9:02 in the morning." She held the 2 papers up to the torchlight. "And this is your ledger. Mr. Barlow, the one I copied, the one where you charged Gideon Rourke. On October 5th, 2 days after the serum was already sitting in your Cinder Hollow warehouse. You didn't charge a transport fee. You charged a ransom. You held medicine hostage, and when they couldn't pay, you let them die." The silence in the pass was absolute. It was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. Barlow's face was no longer pale. It was a sickly, greenish white. He had been beaten, not by a gun, but by a timetable. He told me to—" The shriek came from the ground. Sheriff Kit, weeping, hysterical, was pointing his one good hand at Barlow. "It was him, it was all him, he told me. Let them die. He said the fever was clearing the land for progress. He said to lose the medical orders, to blame the railroad. He said, dead men can't file claims." The confession, torn from him by terror, hung in the air, a putrid, tangible thing. "He's lying," Barlow screamed, his composure finally, violently shattering. "He's a fool, I am a businessman." "And him?" Alma Heath's voice was a low growl, her torchlight falling on the bound form of Vern Slater, who was just regaining consciousness. Slater groaned, his eyes fluttering. He saw Barlow. He saw the rifles. He knew instantly that the game was over. "He's right," Slater coughed, tasting blood. "Kit's a fool, but he ain't lying." He looked at Barlow with pure hatred. "He was settling accounts tonight. That's what he called it. He was gonna have Vance here, kill us all. Me, Kit, and Rusk. To balance the books." Rusk, who had been pale, now flushed with a cold, pure fury. "And the dynamite?" Gideon asked, his voice like the cocking of a hammer. Slater tried to shrug. The brickyard. Yeah, that was Barlow's. He wanted the ranchers motivated to sell a little fire, a little fear. He called it scared cooperation. We were just following orders. It was all out. The whole rotten structure, from the forged ledgers to the dynamite, all exposed. Walt Rusk, his face a mask of stone, walked over to Kit and hauled him to his feet. He snapped a pair of handcuffs on the sheriff's good wrist. He turned and did the same to Slater. "It's over," Rusk said. "No," Alma Heath roared. "It's not. What about him?" All eyes, all rifles, turned on Barlow. "He's a murderer. String him up. Give him to us. Rusk, he's not a lawman. He's a demon." The ranchers, good men, men of the earth, were now a mob. Their grief, their loss, their stolen years, all of it focused into a single, burning point. Barlow, seeing the look in their eyes, finally broke. He turned and ran, scrambling for his buggy. His 2 hired guns, seeing their employer abandoned and their own lives on the line, threw their weapons down. We ain't part of this. We're just transport." Barlow fumbled at the buggy door, his hands shaking. "Get me out of here." He shrieked at the driver. He tried to climb in. Clang! A heavy, black cast-iron object landed on the wooden step, inches from his hand, biting deep into the wood. It was a blacksmith's hammer. Alma Heath stood in his path, her face streaked with tears and soot, her torch held high. She held a smaller, ball-peen hammer in her other hand. "You ain't going nowhere," she spat. Barlow stumbled backward, his feet tangling, and he fell, sprawling into the dust. The immaculate man in the frock coat, the god of Cinder Hollow, was now just a terrified, babbling thing, crawling in the dirt. The mob surged forward, a rope now in one man's hand. "No!" Gideon Rourke's voice cut through the rage. He walked past the ranchers. He stood over Barlow. He did not kick him. He did not offer a hand. He simply reached into the man's breast pocket. Barlow flinched, expecting a knife. Gideon pulled out a small, black, leather-bound book. A personal ledger, Barlow's real book. Gideon opened it. He read aloud, not to Barlow, but to the stars. "Judge Mather, Prescott 10% of all fee collections. Senator Collum, Phoenix $5,000. Cash for water rights. Thomas Vale, County Commissioner, a new house." The crowd gasped. This was not a local sickness. It was a plague. "Kill him," someone yelled again. "No!" Gideon's voice was a thunderclap. He snapped the book shut. We do not become him. We do not do his work. This isn't revenge." He looked at Barlow, a man he had dreamed of killing for 2 long, empty years. "This is justice, and justice must run its course." He looked at Walt Rusk. "Bind him. You're not taking him to Prescott. You're not taking him anywhere Judge Mather can touch. You are taking all 3 of them, and this book, to the territorial court in Yavapai. Let the entire territory see what he is." Rusk, his face filled with a new, strange authority, nodded. "Yes, sir." Gideon turned from the broken men. He looked at the faces of his neighbors. They were no longer a mob. They were just tired, broken people. Nora stepped to his side. She looked at them, at the hard, cracked earth of the pass. "He cut the lines," she said, her voice quiet but carrying. "He cut the water. He tried to cut us off from each other. He tried to break the people, but he failed." She looked at Gideon, and their eyes met. A silent, powerful promise. She looked back at the ranchers. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice finding its strength, "we will rebuild the barn. We will dig out the ditch. We will reconnect the water. And we will mend the people." It was not a command. It was a vow. As Rusk and the ranchers loaded the 3 prisoners, Barlow, Kit, and Slater, onto a single bound wagon, the pass grew quiet. The night, which had held its breath in a scream of gunfire, let it out in a long, slow sigh. The torches were put out. The air grew cool. The only sound in Devil's Notch was the ancient, dry, rasping of the insects in the brush. An old, dark era had just cracked, its ending marked by the faint, rearing sound of the crickets. The ride back from Devil's Notch was a silent procession. The ranchers had peeled off one by one, heading to their own homesteads, their faces grim but their shoulders set. They were no longer a mob, but a fellowship, bound by the shared, ugly truth. Rusk, with 2 men as a guard, was taking the long, slow road to Yavapai, the wagon carrying the 3 prisoners, the banker, the lawman, the gunman, a physical manifestation of the territory's sickness, now lanced and draining. Gideon and Nora rode last. Storm, the big gray, was a steady, solid presence, and Nora's mule plodded beside him, its weariness a match for their own. The moon was high and cold, a chip of bone in a black sky. When they reached the cabin, the silence was deafening. The ruin of the barn was a great, black shadow, a missing tooth in the landscape, but the cabin itself, The little stone and wood box that had been their fortress was standing. It was safe. Gideon dismounted, his movement stiff. He turned and, without a word, lifted Nora from the mule's back. His hands spanned her waist, and he did not set her down immediately. For a moment, she was suspended, her boots inches from the ground, her face level with his. They were both caked in the dust of the pass, their clothes smelling of smoke and iron. He lowered her gently. The night air was sharp, and a light rain of dust, the dry, settled remains of the storm, began to tink, tink, tink against the tin roof. Nora, her body finally registering the end of the fight, began to tremble. It was not a shiver of fear, but a violent, systemic reaction. The adrenaline was gone, leaving a deep, cellular cold. "You're freezing." Gideon's voice was a low rasp. He did not guide her to the door. He stripped off his own heavy duster, the one that smelled of him, of leather and sage and the faint, lingering scent of gunfire. He wrapped it around her shoulders. It was huge, swallowing her, but it was a warm, heavy, and immediate comfort. He unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin was cold. The fire had been dead for hours. He sat her on the settee, in the same spot where she had first woken, and knelt before her. He took her hands, which were ice-cold and raw. Her knuckles scraped from the fall in the square. He began to rub them, his large, calloused hands enveloping hers. He chafed them, not gently, but with a fierce, life-giving friction, trying to force his own warmth into her. "It's over, Nora," he said, his head bent, his eyes on her hands. "It's done." She watched the top of his head, the dark, unruly hair, and a terror, a new and different terror, seized her. "I was so afraid," she whispered, her voice breaking. "At the notch, when Kit fired, I wasn't afraid of the bullet. I was afraid he'd hit you, and that I would be alone again, that I would have to see it." He stopped rubbing her hands. He looked up. His face, in the pale moonlight from the window, was a map of exhaustion. "That's my fear, Nora," he said, his voice raw. "Every day, that's the one I live with." He let go of her hands, stood, and walked to the stove. He lit the fire, his movements automatic, practiced, but he did not stop there. He went to the rough-hewn shelf where he kept his few dishes. He took down a tin bowl. He set it on the table, an empty, lonely circle in the gloom. You told me about the orphanage," he said, his back to her. "How you were small, and in the dark. I've been in my own kind of dark." He traced the rim of the empty bowl. "When Eliza died, I told you, but I didn't tell you the truth. Not all of it. Every morning, for 2 years, over 700 days, I've gotten up, and I've set this bowl. I make coffee, and I set out her bowl, just in case. Just a habit." He tried to laugh, but it was a dry, broken sound. A cough. "I'm a fool. I'm a man who sets a place at his table for a ghost. A man who is too stubborn, or too afraid to even pack her things." He swiped at his eye with the back of his dirty sleeve. "I told you I was afraid of burying anyone else. That was true, but Nora, I'm afraid I'm too late. I'm afraid I've spent so long setting a place for the dead that I've forgotten how to make room for the living." It was the rawest confession of his life, a declaration of a heart so broken. It had become a ritual, a shrine to its own emptiness. Nora's heart ached. She stood up, the heavy coat pooling at her feet. She walked to the table. She looked at the empty bowl, the symbol of his grief, his loyalty, his terrible, stuck loneliness. She did not fill it. She did not hide it. She picked it up. The tin was cold. She turned and walked to the mantelpiece, the one that held the clock, the one that held his wife's tin-framed photograph. She did not put the bowl next to the picture. She put it behind it, slightly to the side, elevating the photograph, making it a frame. She stepped back. "We don't replace the memories. Gideon," she said, her voice soft, but as certain as her penmanship. We just make room. We make them a part of the present. We make them a place to stand." He stared. He looked at the mantel. The photograph, which had been a sad, flat object, was now different. It was honored. It was complete. She had not erased Eliza. She had given her a place of honor, while simultaneously clearing the table. He looked at Nora, at this small, ink-stained woman who had faced down his ghosts with the same steady courage she had used to face down Barlow. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He did not grab her. He did not pull her. He simply stood in front of her, his hands at his sides, his whole body thrumming with a light and a pain that were so new. He could not name them. And then he opened his arms. She stepped into them. It was not a hug of desperation. It was a hug of arrival. He wrapped his arms around her, his big hands spreading wide across her back, holding her as if she were made of glass, as if she were made of steel. He buried his face in her hair, in the soot and smoke and the faint, clean scent of her. "Nora," he breathed, and it was a prayer. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her hands gripping the rough fabric of his shirt, and she held on. She held on as if she were anchoring him, as if he were anchoring her. "This," she thought, "this is not the dark. This is not the closet. This is the opposite." He pulled back, just enough to see her face. His hands moved from her back to her shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of her collarbone. I am not too late," he whispered. A statement, a question. "No," she whispered back, tears, hot and sudden, welling in her eyes. You are just in time." He looked at her, at the tears that were not of sadness, but of release. He bent his head, and his kiss. This second kiss was nothing like the first. The first, in the shed, had been a question, a desperate, fumbling thing in the storm. This was an answer. It was deep. It was sure. It was certain. His lips were not chapped and hesitant. They were warm and firm, and they knew exactly what they were doing. He kissed her with a gentle, profound certainty. A kiss that said, "I see you. I am here. I am yours." Her hands, which had been clutching his shirt, released and moved up. They framed his face, her fingers tracing the rough stubble on his jaw. Her palms cub his cheeks. She kissed him back, not with passion, but with a matching certainty. A kiss that said, "I am found." The sound in the cabin was only of their breathing, a soft, ragged harmony. The SSC of cloth as his hand moved from her shoulder, down her back, a long, slow, respectful sweep, his palm flat, warm, and steady. It was a gesture of possession, but also of protection. Mine, safe. She broke the kiss, breathless, and pressed her forehead to his. Her eyes closed. The tears she had held back now tracked through the dust on her cheeks, and she was smiling. A small, watery, brilliant smile. I think," she breathed, "that you have ink on your face. From my fingers." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that rumbled in his chest, a sound she had never heard. Then we match." He kissed the tears from her cheeks, one by one. He looked at the single cot, the one she had used, and then he looked at her. "Nora," he began. She put a finger to his lips. It's all right, Gideon, just for tonight. Just hold me. That is all. That is everything." He nodded, a deep understanding passing between them. He walked to the lantern, and with a steady hand, he turned the wick down. The flame shrank, and the shadows in the room, which had been sharp and distinct, now rushed to the center. The 2 shadows, one tall and broad, one small and slender, which had been standing apart, now merged on the rough-hewn wooden wall. They became one, a single, indistinct, and quiet shape in the gathering, peaceful dark. When the light returned, it was not from the lamp. It was the thin, gray, pre-dawn light, the color of milk. Nora was asleep, curled on the cot, under his blankets. He had taken the chair, the Spencer rifle now leaning, unused, in the corner. He had watched her sleep, had watched the lines of fear and exhaustion slowly fade from her face, replaced by a peace that made his own heart ache. He was stoking the fire, making coffee, the real coffee, the good beans he kept hidden, when her voice, small and thick with sleep, came from the cot. That smells better than bean soup." He turned. She was sitting up, his duster still wrapped around her. "It is," he said, and his own voice sounded different, lighter. She came to the table. The exhaustion was still there, but the fear was gone. After they drank, in a silence that was no longer empty, but full, Nora's eyes went to the table, to the scattered, rolled-up maps of the canal. She unrolled the main one, the one she had redrawn, the one with the red bloodline of Barlow's railroad. "The dynamite," she began. Rusk is handling it. He's impounding it as state's evidence." Gideon said, "Good," she said. She took a piece of charcoal. "But the flood and the fight, the ditch, it will need repair." She pointed. "Here, the North Junction, it's collapsed. We will need to redig it, at a better angle." He came and stood beside her, his hip brushing hers, looking down at the plans. He pointed. If we do, we can add a spur, here, to Alma's forge. She needs the water too." It was happening, without them even saying it. Love, in the cabin, was not a poem. It was a plan. It was a blueprint for irrigation. It was life. Nora looked at the map, at their hands, his large and calloused, hers small and ink-dusted, pointing at the same future. We should," she said, her voice shy. "We should put up a sign, in town, when we are able. A sign for what?" For us," she said, her courage returning. "For Lark Rourke. I can do ledger help. For the ranchers. Make sure their books are fair. And you can sell your herbs, your chamomile." He looked at her, this brilliant, practical, brave woman. Lark Rourke. It sounded like the name of a new world. He took the charcoal from her hand. He set it down. He took her hands, her ink-stained, scarred, beautiful hands. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice thick. "Tomorrow," she agreed. We will start the ditch." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Tomorrow, I want to take you to the cypress grove, on the high ridge, where the wind, it sings, it does not howl, it sings. I want to stand there, with you." She looked at him, her heart suddenly, wildly pounding. "Gideon," she whispered. I want," he swallowed. This man who had faced down guns. I want, if you will, to speak the permanent words." He was not a man of easy paper. He was not a man of contracts. He was a man of permanent things. Nora Lark, the scrivener, the orphan, the woman who had been told to dig her own grave, looked at the rancher, the widower, the man who had set her free. She did not need a pen. She did not need ink. She just nodded. A single, perfect, permanent yes. Outside, the sun was not yet visible, but the darkness was gone. A pale, milky light, the first light of the new winter, was spilling over the eastern rim of the basin, and it was, for the first time in 2 long years, a promise. The morrow came, but it did not come with peace. Gideon and Nora had gathered the townsfolk at the cypress grove, not for a wedding, not yet, but for a reckoning. It was the place where the water began, and it was the place where the work would start. Alma Heath was there, her forge hammer in her belt, her face set. The Pearsons, the Millers, the families who had names on Nora's list, were there, their hunting rifles held with a new, strange comfort. Even the children were there, holding a rough hand-painted sign, its letters wavy and earnest. Return water to the fields. They stood at the head of the dry canal, their shovels and picks glinting in the sharp morning light, ready to fulfill Nora's vow. They heard the horses before they saw them, not one or two, but a dozen. They fanned out in a practiced military line. Hard men from Prescott, their dusters clean, their rifles new. They were not ranchers. They were professionals. They were escorting the wagon, Rusk's wagon. "Oh, Lord," Alma whispered, her hand tightening on her hammer. "They've come back." The wagon pulled to a halt. In the back, bound, sat Rusk, Kit, and Slater. But the man driving the wagon, and the men surrounding it, were strangers. Their leader, a man with a face like chipped flint, dismounted. "We're here by order of the Yavapai Holdings Company," the man said, his voice flat, ignoring the rifles of the ranchers. "We are assuming custody of this transport." "Like hell you are." Gideon stepped forward, his Spencer leveled. "These men are bound for the territorial court. Change of plans." The leader said. He pulled a folded paper from his breast pocket. "This writ, signed by Judge Mather himself, transfers these corporate assets and their associated liabilities to us for retrieval and silencing." Barlow's reach was a claw that extended from 100 miles away. The judge was his. The leader nodded to one of his men, a brute with a pair of heavy bolt cutters. The man climbed onto the wagon. "We are not here for all of them," the leader said, his eyes cold. "Just the asset. The others are the liabilities." The man with the cutters did not go to Kit. He did not go to Slater. He walked past Rusk, straight to Barlow. Snip. The cuffs fell away. Barlow stood, rubbing his wrists. The hired gun handed him a holstered pistol. Barlow took it, checked it, and strapped it on, his movements slow, savoring. He was a king reclaiming his throne. He stepped down from the wagon, his fine coat dusty, his eyes blazing with a triumphant, nihilistic rage. He looked at the ranchers. He looked at their pathetic, worn tools. He looked at the children's sign, and then he looked at Nora. She stood her ground, her face pale, her hands clutching the heavy, wood-bound ledger she had used at the notch. "You," Barlow hissed, the word a bubble of poison. He ripped the pistol from its new holster and pointed it, not at Gideon, but at her heart. All this noise, because of a woman with a pen. Shut up, woman of letters, no more words. Nora. Gideon did not think. He did not aim. He moved. He threw himself in front of her, his body a shield, his arms spread wide. His own rifle was useless, pointed at the ground. He was completely, utterly exposed. "Gideon, no!" Nora screamed, her hand flying to her mouth. Barlow smiled. This was better. This was perfect. He could kill the rancher, and the terror would break the woman. He squeezed the trigger. Click! The hammer fell on an empty chamber. A dead round. The hired gun, in his haste, had given him a faulty load. Time, which had stopped, violently restarted. In that single but frozen second of Barlow's stunned confusion, another sound broke the air. A grunt, a crash, a body hitting the dirt. From the wagon, Vern Slater, his hands still cuffed, his body broken, had done the one thing he had left. He had launched himself, a bound, human cannonball. From the wagon bed, he tackled the hired gun who was reaching for a new pistol for Barlow. "Run!" Slater roared, his face pressed into the dust, his cuffed hands knocking the gun away. Get the hell!" The hired gun, furious, rolled, bringing his own sidearm up. He pressed it against Slater's side and fired. The shot was a muffled, wet thump. Slater's body went rigid. His eyes, wide, looked at Gideon, not with hate, but with a strange, final, shocking comprehension. Then he went still. "Fire!" Gideon roared, his voice breaking. He grabbed Nora, pulling her to the ground behind the ridge of the dry canal, as the cypress grove erupted in a war. The Prescott men were professionals, their shots disciplined, controlled, kicking up dust, pinning the ranchers. Alma and the others, outgunned and outnumbered, fired back with their old hunting rifles, but they were trapped. "They're hurting us," Alma yelled, reloading, her face streaked with powder. "They're pushing us into the gully. We're pinned." Nora, her face in the dirt, her ears ringing, saw it. Gideon was firing, pulling back, firing, but they were being overwhelmed. Her eyes fell on a coil of fuse and a small canvas bag, sitting by a stack of shovels. The dynamite, the small, quarter-stick charges they had brought, not for a war, but for work, to clear the rockfall at the head of the canal. "Gideon!" she screamed, her voice raw. "The dust! The bank!" He looked at her, then at the charges. He understood. "Cover me!" he bellowed to the ranchers. He fired his last 2 shots. The Prescott men ducked. In that second, Nora grabbed a charge, her hands shaking, but her mind clear. She lit the short fuse. "Go!" She did not throw it at the men. She did not throw it at the wagon. She tossed it, a perfect calculated arc, onto the loosest, driest part of the upper bank. 10 yards to their left. The explosion was not a crack. It was a thump, a deep, subterranean roar. A wall of dry earth, pulverized rock, and alkali dust erupted into the air. A perfect, blinding, choking screen descended, cutting the battlefield in 2. "They're blind now," Gideon roared. "Push them back to the head gate." The hired guns, their disciplined line broken, were coughing, choking. "Where? I can't see." Gideon and the ranchers surged through the dust cloud. They were not firing. They were a wave of pure, primal rage. They did not use guns. They used shovels. They used picks. Alma Heath swung her forge hammer, a silent, terrifying avenger. It was not a gunfight. It was a brawl. Gideon tackled the leader, his fist connecting with a sound like a sack of wet gravel. The Prescott men, mercenaries, not zealots, realized their paycheck was not worth dying for. They broke. They dropped their guns and ran, scrambling for their horses, vanishing into the dust. The battle was over. But in the chaos, one man had fled. Barlow. He had not run for a horse. He had seen his army collapse. He had seen his power evaporate. He was running, his coattails flying, scrambling over the rocks toward the one dark place of escape, the sluice gate, the tunnel that ran under the ridge. Nora saw him. She had lost Gideon in the dust. She was alone. But she saw the black-coated figure, the man who had ordered her grave. "No," she whispered. She grabbed the one weapon she had, her ledger, the heavy wood and leather-bound book that held his crimes. She ran. She was faster on the rocks. She knew the terrain. She cut him off, skidding to a halt on the wet, mossy stones of the headgate, blocking the dark, square mouth of the tunnel. "It's over. Barlow!" she panted, her chest heaving. The ledger held like a shield. He stared at her, his immaculate, pale face, now a mask of sweat and terror. Get out of my way. "You have nowhere left to go," she said. "Your judges are in your own black book. Your men are gone. It is done." "It is done when I say it is done," he shrieked. And his hand, the one she thought was empty, came from his pocket, a knife, a long, thin stiletto. "I will cut the words from your throat myself." He lunged. It was not a feint. It was a low, vicious, killing stab, aimed at her stomach. Nora dodged, the blade singing past her ribs. She did not retreat. She did not cower. She swung the ledger. She swung her book, her trade, her life, in a hard, flat arc. It connected, not with the blade, but with his wrist, a sickening, wet crack. Barlow howled, a high, thin, inhuman sound. The knife clattered to the stones. He stumbled back, clutching his broken, shattered arm. He stared at her, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror, the terror of the body. He lunged again, this time with his good hand, to grab her, to push her, to throw her into the deep, dry canal. "That's far enough." Gideon's voice. He was there. He was covered in dust, his knuckles bleeding. He did not hit Barlow. He did not shoot him. He simply grabbed the front of his fine coat, lifted him off his feet, and slammed him down, hard, on the wet, mossy stones of the headgate. Barlow lay there, a broken, gasping fish, his reign of paper and poison over. Gideon turned, not to the man, but to the wheel, the great iron wheel of the sluice gate. He looked at Nora. She nodded, tears streaming through the dust on her face. He put his hands, his strong, scarred, living hands, on the iron. He heaved. It groaned, the sound of a decade of rust and neglect. And then it turned, a sound, a trickle, a gurgle. And then the water came. It was a clear, silver ribbon. It caught the morning light, spilled over the stones, and ran, for the first time in 2 years, into the channel, heading down, down, down to the dry fields. A sound rose from the townsfolk, who had gathered on the ridge. It was not a cheer. It was a gasp, a sob, and then a roar, a sound of such profound, cathartic joy that it shook the grove. Walt Rusk, his uniform torn, his face bruised, stepped past Gideon. He looked down at the pathetic, whimpering heap of Arthur Barlow. He pulled out his last set of cuffs. "Arthur Barlow," Rusk said, his voice loud, not for Barlow, but for the hills, for the people, for history. "By the authority of the Yavapai territory, you are under arrest. For bribery, for conspiracy, for the murder of Vern Slater, and for the murders of 12 citizens of this basin." He hauled the man to his feet. Gideon turned from the sight. He did not watch them take Barlow away. The fight, the long, 2-year fight, was over. The anger, the vengeance, the thing that had kept him upright, it all drained out of him at once. His knees buckled. He didn't fall. He knelt, one knee on the wet stone, his head hanging, his body shuddering with the sudden, profound weight of peace. Nora was there. She did not try to lift him. She knelt in front of him, in the mud and the moss, and she took his hands, his large, trembling, living hands. She laced her small, ink-stained fingers with his. He looked up. The world was a roar. The sound of the crowd, the sound of the water. The only thing that was real was her eyes. It's over," he whispered, the words just for her. "It's beginning," she whispered back. He brought one of her hands to his lips, his own chapped and bruised from the fight. "Nora," he said, his voice thick, his throat tight. "You are not in my home. You are my home." She didn't cry. She just smiled. A smile that was as bright as the water, as steady as the stone. She helped him to his feet. They stood, together, hand in hand. They walked up to the cypress grove, to the place he had intended for their vows. The townsfolk, Alma, the Pearsons, the children. They parted to let them pass, and then they closed in, forming a silent, solid, living circle around them. They were not just a crowd. They were not just witnesses. They were a community. Gideon looked at Nora, under the singing trees. He did not have a ring. He did not have a speech. He only had the truth. She looked at him, her face streaked with dust, her hair matted with the smoke of the battle they had won. He leaned down, and he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, or of discovery. It was a kiss of arrival. It was salty, from the sweat of the fight. It was gritty, with the dust of the earth they had just reclaimed. It was a permanent, public, and absolute vow, sealed not with ink, but with a life. The crowd did not cheer, they just watched. They stood as the water flowed, as the two survivors, the rancher and the scrivener, finally, stood together in the sun. Thank you for listening to this story. I truly hope it brought you to the high plains, I would be honored if you would leave a comment below and let us all know where you are listening from, so we can share in this journey together. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and if you can, support us further by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by more folks.